In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural raw salmon material. And if you'd like to purchase this procedural material, you can get it with the links in the video description. So after I show you how to create the material, I'll show you how to join it together into this custom node group with many different customizable settings. So I'll just go over the settings. Before I do that though, I did want to let you know about a sushi tutorial series which I created a little while back. So if you're interested in creating like procedural food and these type of materials, then definitely check out that sushi tutorial series where I create these different sushi models and they all use procedural materials. But let's now go over the material settings. So there's the scale value, so you can use this to change the size of the entire material. Then we have this kind of zigzaggy pattern, which is like the bits of fat and the connective tissue. So we have the zigzag width, and then we also have the zigzag height. So you can customize how that looks. And then we have the meat color. So you could make this maybe like a little bit more red or a little bit more pink, whatever you want to do. And then we also have those lines there, which is kind of like the fat and the meat and the connective tissue. So I just kind of have that as a light color. Then we have the scale of the line. So you can have more lines or less lines. Then we also have the thickness of the line. And if you want to make the lines really thin, you can also just type in a value, like maybe type in 3 or 5 to make them even more thin. Then we have the lines distortion, so you can just make the lines a bit distorted if you want to. And then we have the offset of the lines if you do want to just kind of move them up and down. And then we also have the subsurface, and this really makes it look more soft and fleshy and looks more like food. Then we also have the subsurface scale, so you can see it's going to add more and less subsurface. So you can definitely customize this depending on the size of your object. And then we also have the subsurface color, so you could go with maybe more of like a pink color or more of like an orangey or kind of a red color just to change the subsurface. Then there's the roughness of the material, so I have it kind of shiny so it looks a bit more wet. And then there's also 4 bump strength. So there's the dots bump strength, which is just a very subtle texture with some little dots. There is the noise bump strength, which is just like a bit of noise. Then there's also the lines bump strength, and then there's also the meat fibers bump strength. So if I zoom in really close, you can kind of see there's some little kind of lines going back and forth, which is like the meat fibers. So if you'd like to purchase this procedural material, you can get it with the links in the video description. You can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials. So my Ultimate Material Pack comes with all my materials and they're all pre-set up in Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. Now I've also created another 10 food materials, so I've just released this procedural food material pack, and these are with all of my 10 most recent food materials that I've created. So if you'd like to purchase that, links are in the description. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist. And also definitely check out my sushi tutorial series if you want to learn how to create sushi in Blender using procedural materials. So first I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So I went to the add menu and added an icosphere, and right behind me I turned the icosphere subdivisions up to 6 so it is nice and smooth and round, and I'll just shade the object smooth. And then I want to make this better to the real life scale in Blender, and the default objects are like a bit higher than an average human. So for just like a fish fillet or a small bit of fish, it needs to be way smaller. So I'm going to scale the object down by a 0.05. So just 0.05, press Ctrl A and just apply the scale. So that is still kind of a big object, but that's much closer to the real life scale in Blender for just like a fish fillet. So then I did also want to model like a fish fillet object. So you can see I just like added a cube and I added some different like loop cuts to the cube. So if I go to the add menu, add a cube, I'll just scale the cube way down and apply the scale. And then if I go into edit mode, I can kind of squish it down on the y-axis, bring it up on the z-axis. I can add some loop cuts by hitting Ctrl R, adding a few loop cuts here, and then I can like select the loop cuts, drag this out here, select these and kind of drag them in here like that. And then I'll hit Ctrl 2 to add a subdivision surface with 2 levels, and I'll shade the object smooth. And then in edit mode, I can like add some loop cuts to kind of sharpen this up here and add a few loop cuts in the middle, and maybe also add like another loop cut here. So that's pretty much how I modeled the fish fillet. So then I also added a camera, and if you select the camera and go to the object data properties, I turn the focal length up to 80 just to kind of zoom the camera in a bit. And then for the lighting, I added these 2 different area lights right here. So if you go to the add menu, you can go to light and add the area light. So for this area light, I turn the shape to disk and I turn the power to 10. So I'll go into the rendered view. So you can kind of see we have some nice bright lighting shining down the objects. Then I also added this bigger area light on the back as kind of a rim light. So you can kind of see there's just a bit of a rim light kind of on the edges there and also right up there. And so I turned the power just to 2. And then also if I go here to the world properties, if I open up the surface here, I added in this Chinese garden HDRI from polyhaven.com. So I'll have a link in the video description if you want to download it. And I download the 1K HDR version. So what you can do is click on the yellow dot next to color and choose environment texture, and then click on the open button and open up the downloaded HDRI to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections. Then if I go here to the render properties, I opened up the film tab and I turned on the transparent button so you can't see the HDRI in the background. And also here on the color management, I'm going to use the view transform of filmic and the look to very high contrast. And I am going to be using the Cycles rendering engine for more realism. However, you can see it does work in Eevee, but because it is kind of detailed, it is a little bit laggy in Eevee. So you can use Eevee, but I'm going to be using the Cycles render engine. So I'm going to go to the shading workspace. So I have the 3D viewport right over here. Let me just make this smaller and I'll go into the rendered viewport mode. So I'm going to select the object and we'll add a new material, and I can just call this raw salmon. And then I will also select the other object and add the raw salmon material. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on. So you can click on edit and you can go to the preferences. You can go to the add-ons tab and just search for a node and just enable the Node Wrangler add-on. And I'll show you how to use it in the video. So I'm going to start by going to the add menu and searching for the wave texture. Let's drop it here. And then I will hold down the control and shift key and select the wave texture to preview it on the objects. And then using the Node Wrangler with the texture selected, you can hit Control T and that's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I'm going to use the object coordinates. So I'll put the object into the vector. Now this is going to become a somewhat complex setup and I do want it to be very easy to understand what everything does and easy for you to follow. So I'm going to be joining the nodes together into frames. So I'm going to click and drag to box select the texture coordinate and mapping, and I'll hit F to join it into a frame, and then I can add a label and I can just call it mapping. So let's change the wave settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 30, and on the X here, I'm going to change this to Z instead. So they're going back and forth here. And then I'll turn the distortion up a little bit to 4, so it just looks a bit distorted. And you could turn the detail up, but I'm actually going to leave it down. So now what I want to do is I want to make kind of like that zigzaggy pattern so that it goes up and down. So I'm going to duplicate the wave texture and then hit the backspace to reset the values with the wave texture selected, and I'm going to drop the wave texture right here. So this wave texture is going to be in between the mapping and the wave. Now let's change the settings for this one. So I'll leave it at X. And I'm going to turn the scale to a 2.5, and let me just Control Shift select it so you can preview it. So the scale at 2.5, and the distortion I'll turn to a 1.5. And then the detail I'll turn all the way up to the max of 15, and I'll leave the other settings how they are. So you can see it's white over here, and then it's white over here, but then in the middle it's black. And so we're going to be using this to distort the other wave texture. And so as it transitions from white to black, it'll move up. And then as it transitions again, it'll move down. So this way we're going to use this sort of like a gradient to distort the texture. So it has that zigzaggy pattern. Now it's affecting it way too much. You can see it looks really distorted and weird. So what I'm going to do is search for the mix color. I will drop the mix color in between both of the waves. And I'm going to put this original mapping into color A. And then we're going to take the color and I'm going to put that into color B. So now we're mixing between the mapping which isn't distorted and the wave which is distorted. And then here on the mix type, I'm going to change this to the linear light because that blend works better for blending between distorting it. So now you can see I can drag the factor around, and if the factor is at 0, it's not distorting the wave at all. But then as I turn the factor up more and more, it's using more of this wave, which is basically like a gradient. So it's going to distort it more and more. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.04, just a 0.04. So now you can see the wave here. It's white here and white over here, but black here. So it's black in the middle. So if I just preview the second wave, as it turns more black, it goes up and then it goes back down. So we're getting kind of that wave pattern. However, I do want to make it a bit more sharp. So what I'm going to do is search for RGB curves and drop the RGB curves right here after the first wave. And I can use the RGB curves to kind of change the shape of that distortion. So I'm going to click here to add a dot in the middle and just leave it there in the very middle. Then I'm going to click here to add this dot, or just drag the existing dot down here. You can see it's kind of changing that shape. Then I'm going to click here to add another dot and click here to add another dot and kind of drag this down so it's a little bit more sharp. And now you can kind of see that zigzaggy pattern is getting more sharp. So just like that. And then I'm going to click here to add another dot and drag this up a little bit and do the same thing over here on this side. So just like that. So let's drag this down here. So you can kind of fiddle around with this so you can see it kind of lumps up then it goes over here, then it kind of slightly caves in, then it's a bit sharp there, and then over here it kind of lumps over again. So you can kind of see we're now getting that sharp zigzaggy pattern. So then to keep everything really organized so we can remember what everything does, I'll box select these nodes, hit F to join them into a frame, and I'll call this gradient. And I'll just drag this right up here. Then we can also take the linear light and we'll put that there into the gradient as well, because that is kind of like distorting it. So now what I want to do is I want a custom value to change the thickness of the lines. So what I'm going to do is search for a hue saturation value, and we're going to put this here after the wave texture. Let's drag these over so we have a bit more space. So now you can see I have a value which I can drag up and down, and that's going to make the lines thinner and thicker, so we can use that later in the custom node group. So let's box select these two nodes, hit F, and then we will add a label, and I'm going to call this lines. Now I do also want to search for a color ramp, so if you type in ramp on the search, you can add a color ramp and drop it here after the hue saturation value and put it there in the lines texture, and I'll drag it up here. And I want to make everything a bit more contrasted, so I'm just going to drag the white tab right over there so the lines are a bit more thin on default. But this value can still be used to change the thickness of it, and you can hold down the shift key to make your movements more sensitive to kind of drag the thickness of that. So now what I want to do is I want to create a texture for the meat fibers. So for this, we're going to search for a Voronoi texture. We'll put it up here, and I'll just preview the Voronoi. And then what I want to do is take the same mapping from the object here, so object and the texture coordinate. So let's put the mapping vector here into the vector of the Voronoi, so it's using the same object coordinates. And what I'm going to do is change the settings now of the Voronoi. So on the F1, I'm going to change it to smooth F1, and I'm going to turn the scale to 400. And also let's turn the detail up to 2. So now what I want to do is kind of stretch this texture so it looks more like the meat fibers. So I'm going to search for another mapping node, and we'll stick it here before the Voronoi. And now what I can do is just change the scale values to stretch it. So I'm going to turn the X to 3 on the scale. I'm going to turn the Z to a 0.4, but then I'm going to leave this other value at 1. So you can see now it's looking stretched. Then what I want to do is make it more contrasted. So I'm going to search for a color ramp. So you can search for color and you can see it's right here. Or if you just type in like ramp, start to type in ramp, it's at the top. So add a color ramp. So drop the color ramp here after the Voronoi. And then I'm going to drag the black tab to about there, about halfway, so it's more contrasted. So now what I want to do is mix the lines and the meat fibers together. So what I can do is just hold down the shift key and select both color ramps, and I'm going to hit Control 0. So Control 0 is going to add this mix color, so we'll drag it over here and click on the arrow to open it up. And on the mix type, I'm going to change it to darken, and then I'll turn the factor all the way to 1. So you can now see we're taking this texture, and we're mixing them together and just adding the dark values so they're on top of each other. So we're going to be using this texture later into the bump. Let's box select these nodes and drag them back, and I now want to create the color for the base texture. So I'm going to search for the mix color, drop the mix color here, and what I want to do is take this hue saturation value, and we're going to put that into the factor. So now if I Control Shift select the mix here, I can change these two different colors. So you can see I can change the colors for color A and color B, and so that's going to be the meat color and then the lines color. And so now we can take the mix result and put that into the base color, and I'll Control Shift select the principled shader to preview it. So now we can make the different custom colors here. Before I do that though, I do want to make it more subtle. So what I'm going to do is search for another color ramp. So type in ramp and add a color ramp, and I'm going to put it here in between the mix color and the hue saturation value, and I'm going to drag it right down here under the color ramp. So now what I'm going to do is drag this white tab over again, so you can see the white lines there are a bit more thin, so drag it to about there. And then I'm going to take the black tab and I'm going to make it much lighter, so drag this up much lighter. And why I'm doing that is so that the white parts there for the lines, the white parts are going to be lines, we're going to make that much more subtle. And so if you want to use the exact same color I'm using for this tab here, you can click on this tab and go to this color, and you can punch in this hex code, so type in F3, 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 FF. So you can see it's basically just a really light color. It's just slightly darker. But then this tab here, that's going to be fully white. So then this color ramp is going into the factor. So now I can make the two different colors for color A and B. So for color A, I'm going to make this like a really bright color. And for color B, this is going to be the salmon meat color. So you can see if I just click on this color ramp and press M to mute it, this is what it would look like before. But then by adding that contrast there, or the lack of contrast, you can now see that those kind of white bits are very subtle. So then back over here on the mix color, if you want to use the same exact colors I'm using, for color A, this is going to be very slightly yellow and fully white. So you can punch in this hex value if you want to get the same color. And then here in color B, this is kind of like a reddish, orangey, slightly peachy color, kind of like a fish flesh color. And so here's the hex value if you want to punch in the same color. So make sure the mix result is going into the base color of the material. And then let's turn the roughness down to like a 0.3 so it's a bit more shiny. Then to make it look more fleshy and more like food, I'm going to open up the subsurface and I'm going to turn the weight up to like a 0.7 so that it's going to allow light to go through the mesh and it'll look more smooth. And then instead of using random walk, I'm going to change it to random walk skin because I find using the skin type definitely makes it look more like raw flesh. Now you can see there's a radius here, and so I can turn this radius up to get like the red, green, and blue values. But instead what I'm going to do is duplicate this mix and drop it down here, and I'm going to put the result here into the radius. So this way we can add a custom color for the subsurface radius. So that's going to be like the subsurface color. Now the factor, I'm going to turn the factor all the way up to 1. So you can now see color A is disabled. So I'll just make it black. So color A is disabled. It kind of grays out because we're turning the factor all the way to 1. So it's just going to use color B. So for color B, for the subsurface color, I'm going to use this color here. And here's the hex code if you want to punch in the same color. So you can now see kind of like on the edges here and stuff. If I change this, you can see there's the subsurface, so it looks a bit more fleshy and more clear. You can kind of see through it. It almost looks a little bit waxy because there's light going through the mesh. And so if you want to, you can give these mixed colors labels. So I'm going to press F2 to give it a label, and I can call it color. And then if I click here and press F2 to give it a label, I can call it subsurf color. And this one here, maybe I'll just rename this to base color, just so that things are really organized and you can remember what everything does. So now what I want to do is add some bump because right now it looks quite smooth. So what I'm going to do is search for a noise texture, and let's drop this noise texture down here, and I'll Control Shift select it to preview it. And I again want to use the same texture coordinate mapping, so I'll plug the vector into the vector, and I'll change the settings of this noise texture. So I'm going to turn the scale to 10, and I'll turn the detail to 3, and I'm going to turn this linearity to a 6.2, and now you can see there's like a few tiny little dots. So now what I want to do is search for the bump node to convert the noise texture into bump data. So let's drop the bump node right here, and the factor can go into the height value. So if you preview the bump, you can see now it looks nice and bumpy. And I'm going to leave all the settings of the bump at the default. So strength of 1, distance to 0.001, filter width of 0.1. So let's put the bump normal into the normal of the principled shader, and I can now Control Shift select the principled shader to preview it. So if I look there closely, you can see there's a little bump over the surface. So we'll select these nodes and I'll press F to join it into a frame, and I can call this like dots bump. So let's now go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for another noise texture, drop it here. And again, I want to use the same mapping, so I'll put the vector into the vector of the noise. And I'll just preview this noise texture, and let's change the settings. So I'll turn the scale to like a 40, and I'll turn the detail up to 10, and I'll leave the other settings how they are. And then I want to search for another bump, and we'll drop this bump after the noise, and the factor needs to go into the height value to convert it to bump data. Now on the distance here, I'm going to turn this to a 0.005, so you can see now it is a bit more bumpy. Now to mix both of these together, what we want to do is take the bump normal and we want to put this into the normal of this bump. So now if I Control Shift select this bump to preview it, you can see here's the first one and then here's the second one, so they're both mixed together. So I'll now put the bump normal into the normal and replace it there. So we have both of them going into the principled shader. We can also box select these two nodes and hit F, and I can rename this to noise bump. And let's box select these and kind of drag them back a little bit, so we have a bit more space here. So now what I want to do is search for another bump, and we're going to drop the bump here. And so make sure the normal is going into the normal. And I now want to take this value here, the hue saturation value, which is the lines, and we'll put that into the height value. So if I Control Shift select the bump, now you can see the fish is actually starting to look bumpy there. So we're going to make the lines look like they're going back in a little bit. However, I do want to change the shape of it, so I'm going to search for the RGB curves. Now let's put the RGB curves after the hue saturation value, but before this bump here. So just stick that right there. And now I can just kind of change the shape of those bumps. So I'll click here to add a dot, and I'll drag this dot kind of right up here, and then click to add another dot and drag this dot kind of over here. So now you can see if I hit the M key to mute it and unmute it, you can see now it looks a little bit more flat there on the tops, and that looks a bit better. So I'll box select these nodes, hit F, and I can call this lines bump. And then here on the distance here, I'm going to turn this to a 0.0007. So it's very subtle. So 0.0007. Now you can see there's just a little bit of bumps there in the meat. Let's Control Shift select the principled shader. And you can see now it just looks slightly bumpy. So it's kind of going back in. The white spots are going back in a little bit. And then I want to add one more layer of bump, which is going to be this darken right here. And that's going to be the meat fibers. So I'll search for one more bump. We'll drop it down here. We can put the darken result and put that into the height value. And then we want to add in the other bumps that we've created. So the normal can go into the normal. So now if I Control Shift select this bump, you can see all the bumps now are mixed together. So this one's going into this one, and then this one. So the bump normal can go here into the normal. Now let's Control Shift select the principled shader. This bump here, I can hit F to join it into a frame. And I can just call this maybe like meat fibers bump. Also, if you want to, you could box select these and hit F and call this like color, because these are like some color nodes. And so there's the meat fibers bump. And so then I also want to make this a bit more subtle, because if I zoom in, it's a bit too sharp. So I'm going to take the distance value and I'm going to turn that to a 0.00015. So 0.00015, hit enter. So now you can see it's a bit more subtle. And then I do also want to click on the invert button, because I think the invert just looks a little bit better, but it's not that much of a difference. So if you don't want to, you don't have to do that. And what I also want to do is box select these nodes, hit F, and this is going to be a meat fibers. I forgot to do that. So there we go, meat fibers. So now because it's joined together into all these frames, it's pretty easy to see what everything is doing. So now to make this material much easier to use and much more customizable, I'm going to be joining it together into a node group. So what I'm going to do is box select all the nodes except the material output. So all of those nodes except the last one, and I'll hit Control G. So Control G will join it into a node group, and I can hit the tab key with the node group selected to go in and out of the node group. So I'll drag the node group right over here. Let's drag it out to make it bigger. And then I can copy the material name and I can paste it here into the node group. So it's called raw salmon. And let's now hit tab to go into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel. I'll just make this a bit smaller. And then if I go here to the group tab and go to the group sockets, I can double click on this to rename it. And I'm just going to rename it to shader because I like that better. So now right over here on the group input, we can plug up all the custom values into the group input to control those values outside of the node group. So what I want to do is take the scale of the mapping, and I want to put that into the group input, and that way we can use the scale value to change the size of the entire material, because all of the textures are plugged up to this mapping. Now if I click on the scale, let me make this smaller, you can see it's going to be 3 values, but I just want it to be 1 value. So on the type here, we're going to change the vector to float, so it's just 1 value. Then I want to turn the default value to 1, but you can see the texture is still gone. That's because I need to hit tab, and I want to turn the scale back to 1. So that's going to change the size of the entire material. So we'll go back into the node group. So now I want to control the height and width of the zigzagging. So again, to keep things really organized for this project, what I'm going to do is drag the group input right here, just stick it right down there in the mapping, and then I'll hit Shift D to duplicate it and drop it up here, and I can hit Alt P to bring it out of the frame. So now we have another group input. We just want to make sure that we don't accidentally plug another value here into that scale. So for the zigzag width, we can change this scale right here, because you can see if I change the scale this way, that'll change the zigzag width. So I'll just drop this right down here inside this frame. We'll drag it back here, and I can plug the scale into the extra socket and then double click on this to rename it, and I'll call it zigzag width. Then I'll hit Shift D to duplicate and hit Alt P to bring this out of the frame. We're going to drag this over here, and you can see there's this linear light with this factor, and I can drag this up and down, and so that's going to control the zigzag height. So I'll drop the group input in here, drop it right over there, and I can put the factor from this linear light here into there, and then I'll just copy this and paste it here, but this one is going to be zigzag height. Then I want to add the colors, so again I'll duplicate this group input, hit Alt P to bring it out of that frame, and then I'm going to drag it right over here to the colors. So let's just drag this like right down here, and I can now take color B and put that into the extra socket first, and then color A and put that into the extra socket. Let's double click on this to rename it, and I'm going to call this meat color, and then this I'll just call like lines color. Then I want to control the size or the scale of the lines. So what I'm going to do is use this group input here because it's pretty close. So you can see there's this wave here, and we have this scale value right here. So I can use this scale to change just the size of the lines. So I'll put this scale, put it into this socket right here, double click on this to rename it, and I'm just going to call it line scale. Then I want to control the thickness of the lines, and so that can be controlled with this hue saturation value. So I'm just going to duplicate the group input and hit Alt P to bring it out of the frame, and I'll just drop it right in here into this group here. Let's drag this down like that. And then I can take this value here on the hue saturation value. We'll put that into the extra socket. And this one we're going to call lines thickness. And maybe I'll just drag it down here and put the wave texture on the top. Put that right there. That's a bit better. And at the very end of the entire setup, once we finish all these, we can click on the group input and hit Control H. Control H is going to make it smaller, but I don't want to do that right now because when I add more values, it's going to add those values. So we're just going to have to do it all over again. So at the very end of the setup, I'll hit Control H just to hide those other values that we can't see. Now also here on this wave texture, I want to be able to control the distortion of this. So let's just take the distortion and we'll just stick it into this one right here. And this one, double click on this to rename it. I'll call it lines distortion. Then I also want to take the phase offset and I want to be able to control that just in case you want to do that. So I'll put the phase offset into the extra socket there, double click on this and I'll call this lines offset. Then I want to control the subsurface. So you can see right over here, we have this group input. So we might as well just use this one. So let's take the subsurface weight here. We'll put that into the extra socket right down here. Make sure you don't put it into these other ones. Put it into this one right here. So it's a new one. I'll scroll down here and I'll rename this just to subsurface. And then also let's take the scale here, put that into the extra socket, and this I'll just leave to subsurface scale. And then for the subsurface color, we have this value right here on color B. So I'll put that into the extra socket. I'll double click on this, hit Control C to copy that. And then this I'll paste here, but I'll call that subsurface color. Then I want to control the roughness of the material. And so since we have this value right here, this group input, I might as well just use it. So I'll put the roughness into the extra socket there and just leave that as roughness. And then finally, I want to control the bump strengths. So I'll duplicate the group input, drag it like right down here. And I want to put the strength here from the dots, put that into this extra socket. And this one, I'm going to double click on to rename it. And I'm going to call it dots bump strength. Then I'm going to duplicate the group input over here and I'll put this strength into the extra socket right there. And this one, I'm going to double click on this to rename it and call it noise bump strength. And then I'll duplicate the group input. It's getting really big, but we are going to minimize it later. And let's put this strength into the other extra socket there. And this one I'll rename to lines bump strength. And then I'll duplicate the group input one more time and we're going to put this strength into the extra socket. And this one, I'm going to be calling this meat fibers bump strength. So what I can do is select all these group inputs. So just hold down the shift key and select all of them at once. So holding down shift, select all of them. So they have all the extra values that they're not using. So if you hit Control H, that's going to make them smaller and they're only going to use the actual ones that they're using. So now if you want to make this look really nice, just kind of customize this. Of course, if you're like never going to go into the node group, maybe it doesn't matter, but this is also a product that I'm selling. I'll be eventually adding it to my ultimate procedural material pack in the next update. And so since I have like a customer base, I want this to be really nice and organized so it's easy to kind of see what's going on. So I'll hit the N key to close the side panel. So there's the final node setup and I'll hit the Tab key to go outside the node group. So we can now just review the final material. So you can see I can change the scale of the entire material. Then I have the zigzag width and also the zigzag height. Then I also have the meat color, so you can make that a bit more red or a bit more pink, whatever you want to do. And then I also have the lines color. Then we have the line scale. We also have the thickness of the lines. And you can hold down the shift key to kind of make your movements more sensitive. We also have the distortion of the lines. We also have an offset. Then we have the subsurface settings to make it look more fleshy. We have the scale of the subsurface. And then also the subsurface color. So again, you could make it more like a pinkish color or more yellow, whatever you want to do. And then we have the roughness of the material. And then we have the dots bump strength. We have the noise bump strength. We have the lines bump strength, and then also the meat fibers bump strength. And if you'd just like to purchase this entire finished procedural material, you can get it with the links in the video description. You could also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials. And I've also just released this procedural food pack, which comes with my most recent food materials, and I do also have a few other procedural food packs, so if you want to check those out, links are in the description. And you can also check out my Blender sushi tutorial series if you want to learn how to create sushi in Blender with procedural materials. And to learn how to create more materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist. So that's it for this video, and thank you for watching.